There comes a moment when the consequences of our choices become impossible to negotiate with. You can distract yourself. You can rationalize. You can convince yourself that you made the right decision. You can tell yourself that distance was necessary, that emotions were becoming too intense, that walking away was the only way to regain control. But eventually the noise disappears. And when the noise disappears, you are left alone with the truth. That is where the avoidant can begin to struggle. Because when someone repeatedly chooses distance from a person who genuinely cared about them, they may initially experience that distance as freedom. There is less emotional pressure, fewer difficult conversations, no one asking, where is this relationship going? No vulnerability demanding an answer. The nervous system may interpret that separation as relief, but relief is not always peace. Sometimes relief is simply the temporary absence of something you didn't know how to handle. And this distinction matters because you can escape a relationship, but you cannot automatically escape the emotional patterns you brought into that relationship. If closeness triggered fear, distance may feel like the solution. But once the person is gone, the deeper issue remains. Why did closeness feel so threatening in the first place? This is where consequences begin to emerge. The avoidant may start remembering the moments they dismissed, the conversations they avoided, the affection they received but didn't fully appreciate, the opportunities they had to communicate honestly but chose silence instead. And suddenly, the person they thought they were escaping becomes the person they keep thinking about. Not necessarily because the other person is chasing them, but because the other person isn't. That silence can be psychologically powerful. When someone was always available and then becomes unavailable, the mind notices the absence. Human beings are remarkably sensitive to loss. What was once familiar becomes missing, and what was once taken for granted becomes psychologically significant. But here's the philosophical truth. Consequences are not revenge. If you stop chasing someone, you're not necessarily punishing them. If you stop explaining yourself, you're not necessarily manipulating them. If you finally choose your own peace, you're not responsible for how the other person interprets that decision. You're simply allowing reality to exist without constantly interfering with it. And sometimes reality is uncomfortable. The avoidant may discover that the person they pushed away was not the source of their emotional discomfort. The discomfort came from within. The relationship merely exposed it. The closeness revealed fears they hadn't resolved, and instead of confronting those fears, they created distance. But distance has a price. Eventually, you have to live with what you chose. And that's the deeper lesson for everyone listening, not just for avoidance. Every decision teaches your nervous system what you are willing to tolerate. Every time you run from vulnerability, you strengthen avoidance. Every time you abandon something meaningful because it scares you, you teach yourself that fear gets to make your decisions. But you can also choose differently, and the person who was hurt can choose differently too. You can stop measuring your worth by whether someone finally understands what they lost. You can stop waiting for their regret to validate your pain. You can recognize that their consequences belong to them while your healing belongs to you. Because the goal isn't to make someone regret losing you. The goal is to become so grounded in yourself that whether they regret it or not no longer controls your life. You cannot outrun the consequences of your choices, but you can choose what you do next. And once the distance has been created, something unexpected can happen. The person the avoidant assumed would keep reaching out may finally stop. This is where the emotional dynamic changes, because there is a profound difference between losing someone and realizing that you no longer have access to them. While the relationship was still active, the avoidant may have unconsciously relied on the other person's continued availability. They could pull away, become distant, delay conversations, or create emotional uncertainty. And yet there was often an assumption that the other person would still be there. But eventually that assumption can disappear. And when it does, the mind starts asking questions. Why aren't they calling anymore? Why aren't they trying to fix this? Have they finally moved on? Did I push them too far? Those questions aren't necessarily proof that an avoidant suddenly understands everything. Human psychology is more complicated than that. But the disappearance of attention can expose something that constant attention was hiding, the true value of the connection. Think about what happens when something is always available. You rarely stop to calculate its importance. You simply assume it will remain there. But when access disappears, the mind begins reconstructing memories. Suddenly, small moments become meaningful. A conversation that seemed ordinary becomes memorable. A gesture that once felt insignificant becomes something they wish they could experience again. This is one of the strange paradoxes of human attachment. Sometimes we don't fully appreciate emotional security until we experience its absence. But here's where you need to be careful. Your purpose should never be to manufacture that absence as a strategy to make someone suffer. That's still emotional dependence. If you're thinking, I'm going silent so they'll panic and come back, you're still organizing your life around their reaction. Real power is different. Real power is saying, I'm stepping back because this relationship is no longer healthy for me. What they do with that reality is their responsibility. That shift changes everything. You are no longer chasing a reaction. You're making a decision. And psychologically, that decision matters because it restores your internal locus of control. Instead of asking, how can I make them value me? You begin asking, why was I willing to accept so little in the first place? That's a much deeper question, because sometimes the person who was taken for granted also participated in the pattern by constantly overgiving, over-explaining, forgiving without change, and remaining available regardless of how they were treated. So when you stop chasing, you're not simply changing your behavior toward the avoidant. You're changing your relationship with yourself. You are saying, my love is valuable, my time is valuable, my emotional energy is valuable, and access to me is not something another person automatically receives while giving me uncertainty in return. And that doesn't mean becoming cold, it means becoming clear. You can love someone and still stop pursuing them. You can understand their fears without volunteering to be damaged by them. You can have compassion for their wounds without making their wounds your responsibility. And perhaps the most important realization is this: if someone only recognizes your value after losing access to you, that recognition is information, not necessarily a reason to return. Let them process it. Let them sit with the silence. Let them discover what your presence meant. And you keep moving, because your greatest transformation begins when you stop trying to convince someone of your worth and start living as though you already know it. When you stop chasing recognition, you finally become free to recognize yourself. And this is where the dynamic becomes even more uncomfortable for the avoidant, because eventually they may realize something they were never prepared to confront. They cannot control what you do anymore. For a long time, emotional distance may have created a sense of control. If things became too intense, they could pull back. If vulnerability felt uncomfortable, they could become unavailable. If a conversation demanded emotional accountability, they could postpone it. Distance became a mechanism for managing discomfort. But what happens when the other person stops participating in that pattern? Everything changes. Suddenly, there is no predictable reaction, no repeated message waiting on the phone, no emotional explanation, no attempt to persuade them to stay, no guarantee that the relationship will remain available whenever they decide they're ready. And uncertainty can be profoundly uncomfortable. The human mind prefers predictability. We like knowing what comes next, especially in relationships. When a familiar pattern suddenly disappears, the brain begins searching for explanations. That is why an avoidant may find themselves wondering what you're doing, what you're thinking, whether you've moved on or whether you still care. But notice something important. This isn't necessarily about manipulation or some secret psychological game. It's about the consequences of losing control over an outcome. And this is where your transformation matters. If you spend your life trying to control whether another person stays, loves you, chooses you, or understands you, you are giving them enormous power over your emotional state. You're saying, without realizing it, my peace depends on what you decide. That's not love. That's emotional captivity. Real emotional strength begins when you accept something most people resist. You cannot control another person's choices. You can communicate, you can love, you can establish boundaries, you can offer another opportunity, but you cannot force someone to become emotionally available. And once you accept that, you become incredibly difficult to destabilize. Because now, if the avoidant pulls away, you don't immediately chase. If they become cold, you don't desperately try to warm them. If they become silent, you don't assume responsibility for filling the silence. You observe, you decide, you move according to your values rather than their behavior. And that is often what creates the biggest psychological shift in the relationship. The avoidant may have been accustomed to emotional predictability, distance followed by pursuit, withdrawal followed by reassurance. Silence followed by another attempt to reconnect. But when you stop completing that cycle, the cycle itself begins to collapse. And here's the deeper philosophical lesson. You cannot control another person's freedom without destroying your own. If they choose to leave, let them choose. If they choose to stay, let them choose. If they choose to reflect, let them reflect. If they choose to regret their behavior, let that be their journey. Your responsibility is not to manage their emotions. Your responsibility is to manage your own life. That's the point where silence becomes powerful. Not because silence is being used as a weapon, but because you no longer need to use words to convince someone to treat you properly. You don't need to prove that you were valuable. You don't need to demonstrate how much they hurt you. You don't need to create jealousy, manufacture fear, or engineer their return. You simply stop abandoning yourself. And when you do that, something remarkable happens. The person who once seemed to have control over your emotional world no longer has the same influence. Maybe they come back. Maybe they don't. Maybe they finally understand. Maybe they never do. Your freedom cannot depend on which one happens, because the moment you stop trying to control their response, you reclaim control of the only life you were ever truly given, your own. You don't become powerful when they finally choose you. You become powerful when their choice no longer determines your worth. And once you stop trying to control what the other person does, something even more profound begins to happen. Your healing starts confronting the very reality they once avoided. This is not about making someone jealous. It is not about posting a perfect life online so they can see what they lost. It is not about deliberately becoming unavailable to create panic. Those are still forms of attachment because your behavior remains centered around their reaction. Real healing is much quieter. You begin sleeping better. You begin thinking more clearly. You start rebuilding routines that had disappeared while you were emotionally consumed by the relationship. You reconnect with people, goals, ambitions, and parts of yourself that you had neglected. And slowly, your identity begins separating from the pain. That transformation can be powerful because relationships often create psychological mirrors. When someone repeatedly withdraws, the person on the receiving end can start questioning themselves. Was I too much? Did I ask for too much? Was I not patient enough? Maybe if I had communicated differently, they would have stayed. But healing challenges those assumptions. You begin realizing that another person's inability to offer consistency does not automatically mean you were unworthy of consistency. Their fear of intimacy does not prove you were too demanding. Their withdrawal does not define your value. And once you genuinely understand that, you stop carrying responsibility for emotions that never belong to you. This is where your growth becomes a mirror, not because you're trying to hold it in front of the avoidant, but because your transformation reveals the contrast between who you were when you were chasing and who you become when you stop. And that contrast can be difficult for anyone to ignore. The person who once expected you to remain emotionally available may eventually encounter a version of you who is calmer, clearer, and less willing to negotiate against your own needs. That's a different person, not necessarily colder, not necessarily harder, just more conscious. And consciousness changes relationships because once you understand your own patterns, you become less willing to repeat them. You may still care. You may still remember. You may still have compassion for the person who hurt you. But compassion no longer requires self-abandonment. That's one of the most important distinctions you can make. You can understand why someone behaves the way they do without excusing what their behavior did to you. You can recognize their wounds without volunteering to become wounded alongside them. You can wish them healing without making yourself responsible for providing it. And perhaps that is what the avoidant eventually encounters when they look back. Not simply your absence, but evidence that you survived the absence. They may remember the person who once waited, but now you're moving. They may remember the person who repeatedly explained, but now you're listening to yourself. They may remember the person who desperately wanted to be chosen, but now you've learned to choose yourself. And that's why healing is so powerful. It changes the question. You stop asking, how do I make them understand what they did? And you begin asking, what kind of life am I going to build now that I understand what I allowed? That question changes your future because your healing isn't supposed to be a performance designed to produce regret in someone else. It is a commitment to yourself. And if they eventually recognize what they lost, that's their realization. If they don't, your healing still matters Because the ultimate victory isn't watching someone regret hurting you. The ultimate victory is reaching the point where their regret is no longer required for you to feel whole. Heal so completely that your future no longer needs their apology to make your past make sense. And once you begin healing, another part of the story often becomes clearer. Regret can arrive long after the decision was made. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of human behavior. People often assume that if someone walks away confidently, they must have felt nothing. If they become distant, they must not have cared. If they seem unaffected after the relationship ends, they must have moved on easily. But human beings don't always experience consequences at the moment they make a decision. Sometimes the emotional consequence arrives later. And that's especially important when someone has learned to manage difficult emotions through avoidance. If discomfort appears, they create distance. If vulnerability becomes intense, they shut down. If conflict becomes overwhelming, they withdraw. The immediate objective is relief, and relief can feel like certainty. They may genuinely believe, this is better, I need space, I can't deal with this anymore. But here's the problem. Escaping an emotion doesn't eliminate the emotion. It simply postpones the confrontation. Eventually, the distraction fades. The relationship becomes a memory rather than an active problem. The phone becomes quieter. The daily routines change. The emotional intensity settles. And in that quieter space, the mind has an opportunity to revisit what happened. That's when memories can become unexpectedly powerful. A person may remember your voice, your patience, the conversations you had, the ordinary moments that once seemed insignificant. They may remember how consistently you showed up. They may remember opportunities they had to communicate differently. And suddenly, the story changes. What once felt like pressure may now be remembered as intimacy. What once felt like someone demanding too much may now be recognized as someone asking for basic emotional consistency. What once felt like freedom may begin to feel like loneliness. But understand this carefully. Regret does not automatically equal emotional maturity. Someone can regret losing you and still struggle to maintain a healthy relationship. Someone can miss you and still be unable to communicate. Someone can recognize your value and still repeat the behaviors that damage the connection. This distinction is critical because otherwise you can become trapped waiting for their regret to become your reward. You start monitoring their behavior. You analyze every message. You interpret every social media post. You wonder whether their silence means they're suffering. And suddenly, even though the relationship ended, you're still emotionally living inside it. That's not freedom. Your responsibility is not to measure their pain. Your responsibility is to build your peace. If regret eventually reaches them, let it teach them. Let them sit with the consequences of their decisions. Let them understand what their behavior cost. But don't rush back into the same dynamic simply because someone finally realizes what they lost. Real change is demonstrated through behavior, not emotional intensity. A person saying, I miss you, is not the same as a person saying, I understand how my behavior affected you. I've taken responsibility, and I'm prepared to behave differently. Those are two completely different statements. One expresses emotion. The other demonstrates accountability. And this is where your standards must become stronger than your nostalgia, because nostalgia has a powerful ability to edit history. It remembers the beautiful moments while minimizing the painful ones. It can make you remember someone's potential instead of their consistent behavior. Don't fall in love with potential. Look at patterns. Look at actions. Look at consistency. And if the avoidant eventually experiences regret, that is their psychological journey, not your assignment. You don't need to engineer it. You don't need to provoke it. You don't need to disappear strategically just to make them suffer. You simply need to stop protecting someone from the consequences of repeatedly choosing distance. Because sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do for another person is allow reality to teach the lesson you couldn't. And here's the deeper philosophical truth. Consequences are not cruelty. They are information. They tell us what our choices create. If someone repeatedly pushes away meaningful connection, eventually they may have to confront the loneliness created by that pattern. And if you repeatedly abandon yourself to keep someone else comfortable, eventually you have to confront the exhaustion created by your own pattern. Both people have something to learn, but your lesson is not to wait for theirs. Your lesson is to become wiser because of what happened. So if they regret losing you someday, let that be their awakening. But don't make their awakening the condition for yours. Their regret may be their lesson. Your freedom is yours. And this brings us to the deepest transformation of all. Because after you've stopped chasing, after you've rebuilt yourself, after you've allowed the other person to experience the consequences of their own decisions, there comes a moment when you realize something extraordinary. You don't need them to understand your pain anymore. Think about how much emotional energy can be consumed by the desire to be understood. You want them to know what they did. You want them to recognize how deeply they hurt you. You want them to understand how many nights you spent questioning yourself, how many times you tried to repair something they kept distancing themselves from, how much you gave while receiving uncertainty in return. And that's human. When someone hurts us, we naturally want acknowledgement. We want the story to make sense. We want the person responsible to look at what happened and say, I see it now. I understand what I did. But here's the trap. If your healing depends on their realization, then they still control your healing. Read that again mentally. If you need someone else to understand your pain before you can release it, you're still giving them authority over your emotional life. And that's the final chain you have to break. Because maybe they will understand. Maybe one day they'll sit alone and replay everything. Maybe they'll recognize the moments where they withdrew unnecessarily. Maybe they'll realize that the person they treated as though they were replaceable was actually someone deeply valuable. But maybe they won't. Maybe they'll continue rationalizing. Maybe they'll tell themselves a different version of the story. Maybe they'll never give you the apology you deserved. And your freedom has to survive every one of those possibilities. That's emotional maturity. It doesn't mean becoming indifferent. It doesn't mean pretending you weren't hurt. It doesn't mean saying, I never cared. It means saying, I cared deeply, I was hurt deeply, and I'm still choosing to move forward. That's strength. Because there is a major difference between emotional suppression and emotional transcendence. Suppression says, I don't care anymore. Transcendence says, I cared, I learned, I healed, and I no longer need this experience to determine who I become. That's a completely different psychological state. And once you reach that place, something changes in the way you look at the avoidant. You stop seeing them as the person who has the power to give you closure. You begin seeing them as another human being on their own journey, with their own fears, defenses, limitations, choices, and consequences. That perspective creates compassion without surrender. You can understand that their behavior may have come from fear without allowing fear to dictate your future. You can recognize their emotional limitations without lowering your standards to accommodate them. You can even wish them well without reopening a door that should remain closed. That is what boundaries look like when they're rooted in self-respect rather than revenge. And this is where I want you to challenge one of the most seductive ideas in relationship psychology, that your victory is watching the person who hurt you suffer. No, that's not victory. If you spend every morning wondering whether they're miserable without you, you're still emotionally connected to them. If you constantly check whether they have moved on, you're still allowing their life to occupy your mind. If your confidence comes from believing they will eventually regret losing you, then your confidence still depends on their future behavior. That's not freedom. Freedom is when you can genuinely say, whether you regret it or not, I am going to be okay. That's when the psychological attachment begins to loosen. And notice the power of that statement. You're not saying they didn't matter. You're saying they don't determine your destiny. You're not saying the relationship meant nothing. You're saying the relationship does not get to define everything that comes after it. You're not denying the wound. You're refusing to build your identity around it. That's the philosophical shift. Pain can become an identity if you keep rehearsing it. You can become attached to the story of what they did to you. You can replay the betrayal, the rejection, the silence, the mixed signals, the disappointment. But eventually you have to ask yourself a different question. What am I going to do with the life I still have? Because your future is still sitting there. Your energy is still yours. Your attention is still yours. Your choices are still yours. And every day you spend waiting for someone else's realization is a day you are not fully investing in your own transformation. So stop waiting. Not because they don't deserve accountability, but because you deserve peace. If they come back, let their actions speak. If they apologize, listen carefully. If they demonstrate genuine change, evaluate it with wisdom rather than desperation. And if they never return, never apologize, never understand, keep walking. Because closure is not always something another person gives you. Sometimes closure is the decision to stop asking the past for permission to live in the present. And that's where the entire journey comes full circle. They chose distance. You stopped chasing. They lost access to the version of you that tolerated everything. You rebuilt yourself. They may experience regret, and you discovered something greater than their regret, yourself. That's the victory. Not that they are crying, not that they're struggling, not that they finally realize what they lost. The victory is that their emotional state no longer determines yours. You have reached the point where you can love without chasing, remember without returning, forgive without forgetting, and walk away without hatred. And that is when you become free, because the strongest person in the story isn't the one who makes the other person regret their decision. It's the one who no longer needs that regret to feel valuable. So let them have their journey. Let them face their choices. Let them learn whatever life is trying to teach them. Your assignment is different. Your assignment is to become so deeply rooted in your own worth that nobody else's inability to recognize it can make you question it again. You don't need them to regret losing you. You need to stop regretting choosing yourself. So let me leave you with this. Maybe the avoidant is struggling now. Maybe the silence has become louder than they expected. Maybe the distance they once believed would bring peace has instead forced them to confront memories, emotions, and consequences they were trying to escape, but that is not your victory. Your victory is something deeper. Your victory is that you stopped chasing someone who kept choosing distance. You stopped begging to be understood. You stopped trying to convince someone of your value. You stopped carrying responsibility for another person's emotional limitations. And somewhere along the way, you found yourself again. That's what this entire journey has been about. Not revenge, not manipulation, not making someone jealous, not sitting around waiting for them to cry, regret, or come back. It's about recognizing that every person eventually has to live with the consequences of the choices they make. If they chose distance, they must experience that distance. If they rejected consistency, they must live without the consistency they rejected. If they pushed away someone who genuinely cared, they may eventually understand what that absence means. But you don't have to stand at the door waiting for their realization. You have a life to build. And perhaps the most powerful thing you can do now is stop asking, when will they realize what they lost? Ask instead, what am I going to create now that I realize what I deserve? That's the question that changes everything. Because you cannot rewrite what happened. You cannot force someone to become emotionally available. You cannot make another person confront themselves. You cannot control whether they return, but you can control whether you return to the version of yourself that accepted less than you deserved. And you don't have to. Let the past teach you without imprisoning you. Let the pain strengthen you without hardening you. Let the experience give you wisdom without stealing your ability to love. And if they come back someday, don't measure their words. Measure their patterns. Don't be moved simply because they miss you. Look for accountability. Look for consistency. Look for genuine change. And if they never come back, keep walking. Because your worth was never determined by whether they recognized it. You were valuable before they met you. You were valuable while they misunderstood you. And you remain valuable after they leave. So let them have their journey. Let them face their choices. Let them discover whatever their own behavior has to teach them. Your journey is different. Your job is to become so secure in yourself that their silence cannot destroy your peace, their regret cannot inflate your ego, and their return cannot make you abandon your standards. That is freedom. And when you reach that place, you won't need to know whether they're sobbing, won't need to know whether they're struggling. You won't need proof that they finally understand. You'll simply look at your life and realize, I survived what I thought would break me. I learned what I needed to learn. I became stronger, wiser, and more self-respecting. And I chose myself. That is the ending that matters. Not because they lost you, but because you finally stopped losing yourself. Don't wait for someone else to regret losing you. Build a life that makes you grateful you chose yourself.